Hi, I'm Courtney Cheetah with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today. And this is our fifth lesson of 10 in the role of birds on Midwest Farms webinar series. Since the year 2000, we've been working with farmers to achieve healthy, viable agriculture that protects and restores nature. We have a 2050 vision in our our three program areas. We aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in our farmland flyways program, hedgerows of habitat the length of To the Moon and Back, which is about 500,000 miles in our farmland wildways program. And we'd also love to have 10% of rivered frontages on farms planted as farmland waterways, leading to 100,000 miles of ravine habitat. We have an array of publications and videos on our resources section of our website, including a publication on nesting structures for beneficial songbirds on Midwest farms and a beneficial bird native plant chart for the upper Midwest. We are super excited. We're going to be heading to Marbleseed next month. We're going to be leading a hands-on nest box building opportunity as well as tabling. So if you're there, come and say hi. We'd love to see you and meet you in person. Today's webinar is on the birds on the farm, balancing biodiversity and food safety. And our speakers are Olivia Smith from Michigan State University and Annalisa Hultberg from the University of Minnesota. Next month will be our 6th lesson on tree swallows helping farmers fight pests, and that'll be on February 3rd at 11 a.m. So I hope you can join us. We are offering 1 credit of continuing education credit from the American Society of Agronomy. To receive that credit, please have your license number handy and enter it into the evaluation form that we'll be sharing at the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Or if you're having any issues, let us know and we can try and help you. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll have Olivia share and we'll get started with her today.
Well, thanks everyone for coming today. I'm Olivia Smith. I'm a professor at Michigan State University, and today I'll be talking about some of the research that I've done over the last few years looking at how big of a risk birds are for food safety and how to mitigate risks. So we have 2 primary learning objectives for this portion of the talk. One is to understand the likelihood that birds will contaminate crops, and the second is to understand factors that increase and decrease the likelihood that birds contaminate crops. And for birds to cause food safety issues, a series of steps need to take place. And so we'll go through each one of these, how likely birds are to do each of these things, and then what mediates it. So to cause a food safety issue, birds need to carry foodborne pathogens, use crop fields, poop in the crop fields, and then the bacteria in the bird poop needs to survive until eaten by people. So we'll start off by talking about how often birds carry foodborne pathogens. So a few years back, I did a study with colleagues where we analyzed across thousands of bird fecal samples to look at how often bird poop in cropping areas, produce farms specifically, carries different key foodborne pathogens. And one pathogen of key concern is E. coli, and so we looked at one specific type of E. coli called Shiga toxin producing E. coli or STEC, and we found that across thousands of bird fecal samples, it was extremely rare in only 0.22% of the samples we looked at. Another one that we looked at was Salmonella, which is another pathogen of key concern, and looking across thousands of bird fecal samples as well, we found it in less than 0.46% of samples had Salmonella. And the third one that we looked at was Campylobacter, which you might not be as familiar with this. It doesn't often lead to outbreaks like the other ones, although it's actually the leading cause of bacterial foodborne illness in people, but it tends to cause more sporadic cases rather than outbreaks. And that one is relatively common in birds and about 8% of bird feces. And this makes sense because this bacteria does really well in birds because their body temperature, for one thing, is about just right for the bacteria. So that's one that's the most common. And we wanted to know what types of birds are likely to be the biggest food safety issues. And one thing that we looked at was the likelihood that native or non-native birds would be carrying Campylobacter, which is the one that birds most often carry. And so we looked at this figure showing the 10 most sampled species that were on produce farms. This is for Western farms that I used to work on. And these two white bars are non-native species. And what you can see is that they're quite a bit higher than these other native species that have these black filled bars. And looking across all the data that we had, the non-native birds were about 4 times more likely to carry Campylobacter than the native birds. So the non-native ones were the ones that we're the most worried about. And being non-native in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. So we were interested in understanding the key features or aspects of the invasive bird species that would more likely lead to carriage of foodborne pathogens. And so we looked across a whole bunch of different things about birds, like if they were flocking species, if they ate insects, if they ate grain, if they migrated, what their habitat associations were. And the thing that we found that was a really important predictor of whether or not birds would carry foodborne pathogens was if they were highly feedlot associated. So this figure is showing the percent of bird fecal samples with Campylobacter against the Birds Feedlot Association, and the highly feedlot associated species much more frequently carry Campylobacter compared to species that have no or only occasionally use feedlots. And this would be species like European starlings that are invasive or native species like common grackle or brown-headed cowbirds. And this makes sense because the birds are picking up the pathogens from the environment. Salmonella, Campylobacter E. coli are all fecal oral transmitted bacteria. So the birds basically need to come into contact with poop and consume it to get infected. And so environments like feedlot have a lot of poop in the environment. And so that seems to be a really good space for birds to pick up pathogens. And then species that move a lot are then able to move onto farms where they can cause issues. And we've looked at a whole bunch of different farm management and larger land use factors. So not just what the farm itself is doing, but kind of what the neighbors are doing. And we found that the scale that birds respond to is not an individual farm, but really this kind of wider land use that predicts whether or not they'll actually be contaminated with foodborne pathogens. So if we want to break this down, let's say this is a focal farm. If you're a farmer, imagine this is your farm that's say 10 or 20 acres. And what we found that birds really are impacted by is this really wider land use in this broader area. So in this example, this area, which we call a landscape, has a lot of forest, it's got agriculture, it's got a little bit of urban space. And so if we think about species that are more likely to carry these foodborne pathogens like starlings, those species can move really big distances in a single day. Some of them move 20 kilometers in a day between a farm and a feedlot, and then they'll move in those really wide areas. And so this broader land use is really what's influencing whether or not birds carry pathogens. And when we've looked across a bunch of different farm and wider land use factors, we found two things that are really important in predicting whether or not birds carry these foodborne pathogens. And the first one is the amount of natural land cover in the wider area. And so here is a figure showing our results where this is showing the percent of bird poop in crop fields that test positive for Campylobacter against the percent natural cover, which would be things like forest or wetland within a 2.1 kilometer area of the field that we sampled. And what we found is that as the percent natural cover goes up, our likelihood of detecting foodborne pathogens goes down. So forests and other natural cover seem to be buffering farms from contamination. The other thing that we found is important is the density of mammalian livestock in the broader area. So this is not what's on the farm. This is really that wider area. So this would be like if your neighbors have high intensity livestock like a feedlot or rangeland. And so here, as the mammalian livestock density in the broader area increases, then we start to get more detections of Campylobacter and bird poops on farms. And so what this means is that to understand the likelihood that foodborne pathogens will be brought into an individual farm, you really have to assess what your neighbors are doing to determine your risk. So if you're looking out and you see a beautiful forest, the birds coming out of there are probably not that big of an issue because in that environment, they're not exposed to the same high intensity fecal contamination, and there are different types of birds that aren't as likely to contact any fecal contamination that's there. But if you look out and what you see as a high intensity feedlot, that's really when you'll want to be concerned that the birds coming out of that environment might be carrying foodborne pathogens. And one thing in particular we looked at was livestock integration on a farm. So a lot of times when I talk about working with livestock on farms, a lot of farmers will ask me about issues with food safety of having the livestock on the farm. And so we were worried that having livestock on the farm would increase food safety risks associated with birds by drawing in birds that could poop and transmitting pathogens to and from the birds. But what we found was that on-farm livestock didn't influence whether or not the bird feces were carrying the pathogens and how often they were carrying pathogens. It was really that wider land area. So it's not what this individual farm is doing, it's really this wider area that determines whether or not birds are carrying these bacteria. And so if we return to our framework, we just talked about birds needing to carry foodborne pathogens, this first step. And we found that these the most important foodborne pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli are in less than 0.5% of bird droppings, except for Campylobacter that's more common. And carriage is more frequent in areas with high intensity livestock and less frequent when farms are in more natural areas. So now we'll move on and talk about bird use of crop fields. So I've worked in Michigan for the last 4.5 or so years, and so I've done some surveys in cherry orchards in northern Michigan, as well as last year I started working with diversified small scale, primarily vegetable producing farms in Michigan. And the most common birds that use cherry orchards are American robins, common grackles, and black-capped chickadee. And these icons are going down in the order that I'm mentioning these birds if you want to see what they generally look like. On diversified small scale farms in Michigan, the most common birds that we see in crop fields are barn swallows, house sparrows, and killdeer. And the types of birds and their abundance will definitely vary depending on where you are, the land use around you, and what you're producing, but these are some of the most common farm birds in the Midwest. And in our previous work, we were really interested in understanding kind of general traits of birds that use fields, just like I was talking about earlier with the feedlot associated birds carrying bacteria. And so we looked at how similar factors influenced how many birds were actually using crop fields. So again, we need to think about not just if birds carry pathogens, but also how often they're using crop fields. And we found that feedlot association was also really important for bird use of crop fields, where this is showing the number of individuals of different species observed per surveyed point that we had in a crop field area. And when birds are highly feedlot associated, then we more often see them in crop fields. And the other thing that mattered was how high up or low down the bird species were foraging. Is labeled strata on this, but that basically means are they in the canopy of the forest or are they on the ground? And the upper canopy foraging species, so species that are foraging at the very top of trees, are much less likely to actually be using crop fields, which makes sense. They want to be up high in the forest. They don't want to come down into the farm. So those are the least likely to come in the fields. So who is likely to use crop fields? Feedlot associated birds are the ones that are most often in the crop fields. And so next we'll talk about what influences whether or not birds poop on crops. And I'll start by just talking about how often fields have bird poop in them based on prior work. If you're a farmer, you probably have an idea of what this looks like on your own farm. But a few previous studies, one conducted in California by some of my collaborators, looked at the number of bird fecal droppings in 1 meter squared quadrant. So they had like a little 1 meter by 1 meter frame, and they put that along the lettuce field and counted how many of those frames had bird poop in it. And they found 0.2 feces per meter squared in lettuce. I previously worked with brassica crops in the western US, And we looked across a little over 1,000 brassica plants and looked for bird poop, and we found bird poop on 3.3% of plants. And then when I was working in Michigan cherry orchards, we looked at over 1,000 different tree branches. And in all those tree branches, we randomly selected a 1 meter section and we checked that 1 meter section for bird poop. And we found that 4.68% of those 1 meter sections had bird poop. And we were interested in any poop on the leaves because bacteria could splash onto crops potentially. But we also looked at individual cherries if we found bird poop. And across 2 summers, I counted 15,890 cherries. And across those cherries, I only found bird poop on 4 of them, or 0.025%. So even if bird poop is somewhat frequent in fields, it's not actually getting on crops that often. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've found to mediate how often we're finding bird poop on crops. So I'll talk first about my brassica study. So this was on a little over 50 farms across the US West Coast. And so we checked over 1,000 brassica plants like this kale plant for bird poop. And then we looked at how different farm management and neighboring land use factors influenced if we would detect poop on crops. And in this case, we found that having mammalian livestock on farms slightly increased the percent of plants with droppings. It wasn't a huge effect. So this was primarily cattle, but also things like sheep and goats. And this tracked prior work that we did where we found that having livestock on farms was able to increase the number of birds on farms. And so this seems to come at a slight cost of getting more poop on the crops. But interestingly, having chickens on the farm didn't matter. So chickens, even if they were linked to increased birds, it wasn't increasing the amount of poop that was getting on crops. And in this case, the natural cover didn't matter. So it didn't matter at all how much things like hedges were on the farm. It didn't matter how much forest there was in the wider area. Um, the amount of poop on the crops didn't respond to that. So next I'll talk about this little fluff ball. So this is an American kestrel. If you've logged on to other parts of the series, you probably heard a little bit about them. So these American kestrels are small falcons, and they're really easy to attract to farms using nest boxes. And so these are some nest boxes that Megan Shave, Catherine Lindell, and others put up in northern Michigan well over 10 years ago now, 15 years ago. And so they put up these boxes for falcons to see if they could attract falcons that could help reduce bird and rodent pests. And so I was really interested in understanding if this could also improve food safety. So the basic idea is that when you have kestrels present and they're easy to attract using nest boxes, they're able to deter small birds. And this is both through their predation on the birds as well as just scaring them away. Either the other birds are scared that they'll be eaten, or the kestrels are just very territorial, so they'll push other birds out. And so the kestrels can reduce the small bird abundance, and theoretically, that should lead to reduced crop damage as well as reduced fecal contamination. And so we have a study that just came out a couple of months ago. It was actually Thanksgiving Day. And so looking across those thousands of cherry branches that I mentioned earlier, we found that in the presence of kestrels, when we had those active kestrel nest boxes, there were fewer branches with bird feces. So the kestrels, in other words, were able to improve food safety by deterring pest birds. And this is really encouraging because we've known for a while that kestrels can deter pest birds as well as rodents. And now we know that they can also reduce food safety risks as well as decrease crop damage. So this is a really multifunctional tool for farmers to use. And these cost price statistics are from a study that came out in 2018. So with inflation, maybe you'd spend $200 at this point on a box. But these boxes lasted about a decade, so it's pretty good return on investment. And after you buy them, the only cost thereafter is that you have to take them down once a year to change out the bedding. So pretty minimal maintenance costs. So this is something that in an area where kestrels are common and when the crop phenology matches well with the bird nesting season, this seems like a tool that can be pretty effective. So we return to our framework. How likely are birds to poop on crops and what mediates that? Natural cover doesn't mediate the amount of poop on crops. On-farm livestock, if they're mammals, can slightly increase your risk of getting fecal droppings on crops, but it's not a huge effect. And kestrels can help reduce the risk. So I'll wrap up by talking about bacteria's survival in poop. So we need those bacteria to survive until eaten in order to be a problem. So in this Northern Michigan study, we cultured Campylobacter in 310 fecal samples collected from trees. So here what we're doing is we're looking for bacteria that are still alive and they're able to be resuscitated on media. And this is different than what I talked about earlier, which is when we were looking for DNA detections. And so when we're looking at DNA detections, when the bacteria could be dead, we find them in about 8% of samples. But when we actually culture the bacteria to look for ones that are still alive, we were only detecting them in 0.97% of samples from trees. And so this was really interesting and suggests that the bacteria aren't surviving for long, which is really consistent with what we know about Campylobacter, that they don't survive very well outside of a host. And so the second year of the study, we decided to catch a bunch of birds. So this is my friend and technician, Sarah. She's very carefully getting a bird out of a net. So we wanted to catch birds directly so we could get fresh poop from them to test. So we put them in these little brown paper lunch bags that were sterile. And then we packaged up the poop and we sent it to MSU's veterinary diagnostic lab. And we had those fresh samples. We cultured Campylobacter in 4.1% of the feces. So it was 6.56 times more likely that we would detect bacteria in fresh feces. So this suggests that the pathogens are probably not surviving for long. Another study that came out about a year ago was led by some of my collaborators at UC Davis. Austin Spence was the lead on this work, where we were interested in looking at E. coli survival in bird poop at different sizes. And so Austin and collaborators had inoculated bird poop with E. coli, and we took it from different species and made it into different sizes. This blue color on the figure is a larger fecal sample, and then the red color are small fecal samples. And so this is showing probability of survival of E. coli over a 30-day period. And what you can see is that the bigger poops have a higher probability of surviving. This figure on the right is the percent of E. coli remaining over this 30-day period. And it's dropping off pretty quickly, but the one that's really remaining the longest, again, is this big sample. And we found by either creating different size poops from the same species or looking at poop from different species that the species in and of itself doesn't really seem to matter a whole lot. What really matters is the size of the poop itself. And what this means is that if you're finding bigger fecal samples, those are ones that you should really be worried about leading to longer survival of foodborne bacteria. Whereas if it's a really small sample, like if you get a poop from a finch or a sparrow, it's likely the bacteria are dying pretty quickly in those samples. So returning to our framework, what we found is that Campylobacter seem to die off pretty quickly, and larger droppings support longer survival, and so those are the ones to be more concerned about. So we can put our birds along a spectrum from more risky to less risky. The ones that are more risky are feedlot-associated species, the ones that commonly are found on crops in large numbers, and those that have larger droppings. And the ones that are less risky are those that forage at the top of the trees and aren't likely to poop in fields. The ones that don't venture into crop fields, and species like kestrels that can scare off birds that cause problems. So in summary, we know that bird feces can make people sick. There was an outbreak of Campylobacter in 2008 caused by wild sandhill cranes. As a general rule, don't pick poopy produce. If you see poop, don't pick the crop that it's on. What you really need to be worried about are those bigger poops. If you see a larger poop, it's more likely to lead to survival of bacteria, and you might consider a no harvest buffer. Feedlot-associated birds are the worst for food safety, but the risk really depends on the context. So if you're in an area with a lot of livestock, that's the biggest risk. If you're in an area without a lot of livestock, that is the lowest risk, or a forested area. The birds in those settings are not as big of an issue. So we have a poll now.
Yeah, we will pop that poll questions up there. There's 2 questions to answer, and then we'll have Olivia go over those. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. That was a ton of information, so much great research.
you want me to answer any questions in the chat or just save it for the end?
There's one question about clarifying if birds are in feedlots that so if birds that are in feedlots are more likely to be present in the fields.
Yeah, that's what we found. So the birds that use the feedlots, they're both more likely to carry foodborne bacteria and more likely to be found in crop fields
Okay.
relative to species that don't use feedlots.
Olivia, can I ask a question? Can you talk more about different species? I know you said that the size of the fecal material is one of the biggest indicators because it's just, it doesn't dry out as much. But can you talk about other species, like things like seagull, beyond songbirds, how those are, what kind of presence of pathogens they have?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work on seagulls, especially in the UK. So seagulls are likely to carry salmonella compared to other birds. So there hasn't actually been too much work on them with Campylobacter, but they are known to be some of the better carriers of salmonella. Songbirds, they die off pretty quickly when they get salmonella, so they're not very good hosts because they just die. But bigger birds like seagulls are more likely to carry salmonella. And then with the study that I talked about with the E. coli experiment, we were testing turkeys were one of the main species that we were testing the survival in their of E. coli in their poop. And so turkeys seem, because their feces are so big, they seem to be pretty good at maintaining survival of bacteria. It's pretty regional whether or not you have a lot of turkeys. So like in the Pacific Northwest, we really didn't see turkeys on the farms, but in California and in Michigan, you see a lot more turkeys. So if you find turkey poop, that's one to definitely be worried about. Sandhill cranes are one to definitely be worried about. They carry more bacteria and they have pretty big fecal droppings. Canada geese also frequently carry foodborne pathogens and have bigger poop. So those are the birds that I would definitely be a lot more concerned about compared to things like sparrows.
Great, thank you. How about crows and other scavengers? Does their diet, if they're scavengers, does that impact things?
Yeah, so they probably have higher exposure to bacteria, and actually crows very frequently carry Campylobacter. And in the study that we just published from Northern Michigan, of the samples that we collected in the field that had Campylobacter, 2 out of 3 that were positive were from crows. So they definitely seem like they're pretty good at bringing in pathogens compared to some other species, and they also have pretty big poop. So crows would be another one that I would definitely be careful about finding their poop.
Great. Let's go over the questions. Do you want to answer those?
Yeah, so question 1, what types of birds are most likely to introduce foodborne pathogens to the farm? So for this one, the correct answer is starlings, blackbirds, and grackles. And for those species, so here we're thinking about introducing pathogens. So this one is really targeting the first thing that I talked about, whether or not they're carrying things like Campylobacter. And so here it's starlings, blackbirds, and grackles. These are the species that they forage a lot in feedlots, and so they probably are encountering the foodborne bacteria a lot more. Whereas species like chickadees, titmice, and nuthatches, those ones aren't venturing down into fecal contaminated areas very often. Same with warblers and flycatchers, and then similarly, bluebirds and tree swallows are often contacting fecal contamination. So starlings, blackbirds, and grackles are the ones to be more concerned about. And then question 2, in which farming scenario would you be most likely to experience food safety issues from wild birds? The correct answer there is on a produce farm near a feedlot. So the birds that use the feedlots, they can pick up and exchange pathogens with the livestock. And a lot of times those species like starlings, they're really good at using agricultural areas. And so they'll move from the feedlot right into produce fields. There's a lot of movement back and forth. So it's attracting species that are carrying bacteria as well as species that will also use the crop fields. And then some of the wrong answers, if we haven't found any evidence that natural cover is bad. In fact, it seems to be good. So things like hedges and forests, it will lower the odds that birds are encountering fecal contamination, and it allows the bird to kind of shift towards ones that are more beneficial, like warblers and flycatchers. And then at a produce farm with a small flock of chickens, we haven't seen that chickens increase risk. We didn't find an increase in the frequency of finding bird fecal droppings with bacteria when farms had livestock.
Okay, well, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And in the meantime, let's move on to Annalisa's presentation.
Great. Thank you. That was a lot of really excellent information, and I feel like I want to ask a lot more questions, but I won't. Good morning, everybody. My name is Annalisa Hultberg, and I'm an extension educator in food safety at the University of Minnesota. I work statewide with fruit and vegetable farmers to help them implement good agricultural practices. I also help farmers implement and understand the FSMA, Produce Safety Rule, the Food Safety Modernization Act. So if you're in Minnesota or in other areas and have those kind of questions or would like to collaborate, I would be happy to talk more. So I'm going to go through, that was a great presentation of the actual hazards that might pose risks on the farm from birds. So I'm going to cover some of those a bit again, and then kind of talk through some activities and practices that farms can take to reduce the risks associated with birds on the farm. I would also love to hear from you. I know we have farmers on this call and we have folks that work with farmers. So please be thinking about ways that you have yourself or those that you know have worked with strategies on the farm to reduce the risks associated with birds while still supporting their presence. So just a little bit more about us. Good agricultural practices writ large are those preventative steps we take on the farm to reduce risks of foodborne illness associated with the consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables, really focusing on those fruits and vegetables that are consumed raw because there might not be that kill step, which could kill the pathogens that can cause the foodborne illness. We already had a great presentation about the different sort of risks. In general, food safety on the farm, we do talk about the risks associated with other sorts of wildlife and then with livestock as well. But here we are talking about birds. And of course, they can be reservoirs for some of those human pathogens, especially given some of the specific instances that Olivia just talked through. I wanted to bring up another outbreak that did happen in eastern Wisconsin. There was an outbreak of salmonella in fresh shelled peas at some markets in Wisconsin. There was actually 2 different outbreaks over 2 different time periods. It seems to be similar or the same strains, but those likely did come from wild birds of some sort. And during harvest, they were using a viner, so it wasn't being hand harvested. They were using equipment that was intended for harvesting things that would be for processing generally. So processing peas are probably going to be handled differently than those that we might consume fresh, but they used equipment that would be for processing, but they used it to harvest things that we consumed raw. So the feces was present. So I bring this up to kind of point our mind in the direction of not just where it's present in the field, but then how does that get onto our equipment and how can we inadvertently spread that around? So the viners are big pieces of equipment that are very difficult to fully clean. So as we buy equipment to wash our vegetables, for example, think about the fact that we probably are going to miss some feces, especially when we're doing mechanical harvest. And if we can't fully easily take apart that equipment, it's going to be difficult to get in there and clean. UV isn't going to get in there. It's not going to dry out well. And things, the bacteria that might be present could grow that pathogenic bacteria and cause illness. The other one would be the big Jensen Farms outbreak in Cantaloupe a few years ago. If you all remember that, unfortunately, 33 people passed away from that outbreak, a number of whom were in Minnesota. And that was traced back to a tractor that went through some runoff that was coming off of a manure pile, among other factors, but that went through this runoff, went into the pack shed, where that listeria then took up residence because there was a lot of water in that pack shed. It went up onto the processing equipment and the washers that were used. And again, it was very difficult to wash them and dry them out well, that equipment. It then took up residence and spread to all of the produce that went out of that farm. So it's important to think about our post-harvest and how that can really spread contamination that might not be much in the field, but when we start talking about water and post-harvest, that water is really good at spreading those pathogens around. So we're not talking about post-harvest much today. We're really just talking about doing our best to look for signs of animals in the field and deter those species as much as possible, but also taking into consideration what we just learned and knowing that many species are actually beneficial because they keep other species at bay. Some of the main things we can do is thinking about where we are planting in relation to what we observe about the habitat and where species are in our farms, looking for signs of species while we're harvesting and chewing and other signs of animals, and then taking kind of common sense measures to deter birds from our fields. Co-management is the term that is used if you've taken the Food Safety Modernization Act training. This co-management is just the idea that food safety doesn't mean that we aren't also managing for resource conservation and wildlife preservation. So we can do both of these things at once. And we're not talking about kind of a slash and burn. And in fact, we know that it actually is quite beneficial to have, as was mentioned, the hedgerows and other things where some of the species can be. It can prevent them from coming into our fields in a way that we don't want them to. So this is a photo of deer going in the spring, but this is an idea that total exclusion is never the goal and it's not possible. One thing to consider is location. So that is a large number of eagles that seem to be perching in the tree. But if you had an area where you knew there were a lot of species that just seemed to always perch in a tree, you might not want to plant things right below that. Also, lines, as in electric lines, phone lines, don't plant right below that. I've seen a lot of poop right below that. If you know that there is water, if there's kind of streams or ponds, maybe sometimes you just have kind of ephemeral ponds that come and go in your farm, they might attract sandhill cranes and geese. And as we know, that larger amount of feces really can impact the amount of pathogens in there. And they can also do a lot of damage to our crops. So if you observe, and I would really recommend noting when you're seeing these animals, then you can take steps to probably just not plant under there, given you can't always exclude things like the cranes. So we're not planting right under there. Trellises often come up. We need trellises for a lot of vegetables. Tomatoes and peas come to mind, but cucumbers, there's a number of other crops that we would trellis either in a high tunnel or in the field. And it is pretty clear that they're obviously going to be a perch for a number of birds. And so that it might be more songbirds, but it could be a lot of birds. If you have, go ahead and write in the chat, if you have birds perching on trellises on your farm or farms that you work with, tell us what you're seeing there. Are you seeing damage to the vegetables themselves? Are you seeing lots of poop? One thing that I've heard from farmers over the years is that it's very important to train your workers to look for those signs and then to not harvest the things with poop. Because maybe the new worker, the volunteer, the CSA member who's out for the day might not recognize that could be a risk, and they might say, well, this is a beautiful tomato. I think we should probably harvest it and we can just flick off the poop. But we know in post-harvest, what could be a small problem in the field really can grow because water is such a great conveyor. And obviously we're not washing tomatoes, but if it was another crop. So what else can we do? Maintaining the fence line sanitation. This is obviously more for mammalian species, but just making it so we're having, just generally mowed areas, certainly not black dirt, but mowing areas around our pack sheds and around the fields can just make it so mice and other rodents aren't going to want to create harborage there. In general, always looking for signs of animal before we harvest. Here are some Swiss chard that have been just decimated by birds or by deer. Pretty clear we're not going to harvest that chard, but again, maybe the worker wouldn't know that and they'd say, well, I don't know, sure, we can, wash it off and pick it for a salad. The reality is pathogens, if present, may or may not be washed off in post-harvest and they might actually spread. So that's why we're just leaving it in the field. It's not worth that risk. The no harvest buffer is there is not a set amount of, oh gosh, it has to be, 1 foot or 5 feet or 10 feet. Use kind of common sense. So you got some strawberries there on the top, you got some rabbit feces on the ground. Is it worth it to harvest those berries? No, it's not. Think about rain splash. Rain splash actually has a lot of force. It can really push up that anything that might be on the ground onto the bottom. Obviously, think about our peppers and things, obviously, are quite dirty sometimes and sandy. So it's just not worth it. If it's a trellised item and the feces is on the ground, and you can just use your best judgment and say, I don't actually know how that feces would have gotten onto the vegetable. Well, then it's probably okay. I would just go ahead and remove it. If it's a larger amount, just get it out of the field. You don't want to track it around. If it's a tiny amount, obviously you can't. But a larger amount, I would definitely take that out of the field if I were you and when possible. And one way to do that is to use those flags that you can flag an area that you see a large amount of poop, and that lets the other harvesters or workers or volunteers know, hey, stay away from here. We're going to come back at a different pass and remove that. Different ways to deter animals, write in the chat which of these work, if anything. There are wildlife are very smart and they get used to things easily. It's hard to say if any of these things work. Obviously, incorporating stuff like movement, like the tail of the coyote there, if it has a tail that's moving, and other things like deer don't really like that. Birds of prey, another kind of aggressive species, can be something that can ward off smaller species. Are we picking a tomato with poop on it and thinking we can wash it in post-harvest? Nah, not worth it. In the pack shed, this is a little different than in the field, but the most important thing is to really just kind of keep them from creating nests and taking up residence. So that generally means monitoring, having someone have it be their job to monitor, to make sure that you're not getting a ton of nests above where you're trying to pack your vegetables. Because once those nests are established, then you can't take them down. So it can be challenging, and I know there's legal implications and laws around protecting many of our bird species as well. But for food safety, it's important to just don't let them take up residence. Some people use bird netting in pack sheds. That can be a good option for some, although it's not perfect. It can tear, and then sometimes you got them in there and then they're flying all around up there. Don't attract them in. That's often more for rodents, but not storing seed and things like that because they're going to be attracted in. Monitoring those pests and then those pest traps and not using baited trap for rodent species. Picture of a bird nest, super common, of course. Again, we're doing our best to not let it be something that is just everywhere so that it could be falling down onto the area where we're packing our vegetables, because our customers assume that we're using great care while we're packing their vegetables and not having bits of bird nests falling into it. Other options, visual deterrents, things like Mylar tape. Has anyone used these? This scary face is kind of scary. I don't know how that might work. If you change it up a lot, it might work. The floppy guy, berry growers use them. For a small, the research has shown you need a couple per acre, so it's not going to be you're not going to have that many of them. Obviously, you need electricity and things, but during harvest, during like specific times of the year, when you have a really high value crop out there that you don't want to be taken, then that might be something to look into. Okay, Allison said, tried something like shiny tape if the sun was shining on it. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. So in summary, there are food safety risks with avian species that it's important to remember. I think it's great to think through which species and kind of the size of the poop and how that matters. I think it sometimes in food safety farms can there's a fear factor. People might get scared and say, "Oh my gosh, there's a tiny amount of songbird poop on the ground in my farm. Do I have to not harvest anything all season?" And it's like, absolutely not. That is not the strategy that is based in actual risk. The best practice is to just look for large amounts of poop, keep your eye on it, and know that it could be a risk, not harvest the things that actually have it because we can't wash it off in post-harvest. And then train the workers because it's not always you that is going to be doing the harvesting. Sometimes it's a very well-meaning volunteer. And the other thing is for quality. It's not great to have our customers get something that's chewed or pooped on or anything like that. They don't want that. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Annalisa. We're going to launch two more poll questions here. So if you could answer those, and then we'll have Annalisa go over those. We have one question in the chat we can just chat on quick. Allison says that she has a lot of problems with birds in her high tunnel. They love to perch on tomato trellises and also on the arch supports. Any suggestions on how she could maybe deter them from being in the high tunnel?
What has worked, Allison? Has anything worked?
No. But I also I haven't been great at forward thinking about it. I kind of like just do what I always do and then get upset when there's a lot of birds in my tomatoes. So that's been really challenging. We did try some uh old CDs that would spin and be shiny. And like, so we put that at both doors of the high tunnel. And I did notice those working when the sun was like directly shining on them, but also with the wildfire smoke and the overcastness, it unfortunately didn't happen as often as would have been, ideal. I could probably come up with some solutions for my tomato trellises, but the birds are going to perch on those arch supports. I have a Gothic high tunnel and there's a lot of overhead piping for them to sit on if I somehow deterred them from getting into the tomato plants.
Do you see damage and poop from them, Allison?
I do, yeah, especially in the tomatoes. I grow tomatoes mostly for myself because everyone grows tomatoes, so I don't feel like it needs to be my primary crop, but it's disappointing. And I also think I have other damage. I don't know if it's mice or chipmunks eating the tomatoes or if it's the birds. Probably the birds are also pecking at the tomatoes. I find that my peppers seem pretty safe from the birds, which is good because I grow a lot of peppers.
Does anybody have advice for deterring birds from the high tunnels?
It's a challenging situation. Yeah.
I don't know anything that is definitely going to be the thing that's going to work, but I've seen people put fencing all around the entrance to try to keep them out. I think they'll still get in a little bit, but maybe helps. And then recently I've been hearing of people using like white noise or pink noise in high tunnels for, I think maybe more so for rodents, but there have been some studies that can be effective at birds. So basically just like a background interference so that the birds are disturbed by the noise.
Can you talk more about the fencing, Olivia? How would that work for birds?
Yeah, so people basically they just I've at least seen this one time. I don't know, maybe I've seen it more, but they had a high tunnel that should be open, and then they put kind of like chicken wire mesh all across the entryway of it, and then just kind of sealed it up all around. So I don't know, it seems like the birds can still get in if you don't get it 100% tight. You might be able to use like bird tree netting or something, maybe it would work to secure it. But I think it's pretty hard to keep birds out, but trying to seal off all entrances might be a way to do it.
But then you would need to be able to access it too. So it would be
Yeah,
a door.
yeah, you'd have to create a door for yourself in it.
Let's go over the poll questions. Annalisa, you want to go over those?
Sure, yeah. So not listeria, not norovirus, no. And it is salmonella. And then we got co-management is the managing simultaneously for both food safety and wildlife conservation. Good agricultural practices are those kind of larger group of food safety practices that we take on farms. That includes things like hand washing, testing our water for potability, and things like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, if there are any other questions, please put them in the chat. This has been really great.
An orchard that Allison said, an orchard that I visit uses a recording of bird distress calls. Someone there. Yeah, it's kind of aggravating. Yeah. One thing, Allison, are you aware of the species that you see in your tunnel?
That's a good question. I would assume it's like the sparrows and God, they're little. They're really small little creatures. I don't really see the swallows because they hunt, more aerial. Um, I'm not getting big birds in there like the grackles we were talking about, which is good. Uh, I'll probably think of the species as soon as we're done with this call because I do like birds and I do think that I'm fairly good at identifying them. You put me on the spot, so I can't think of anything.
But in general, I think
Nice.
it maybe is good to know that they're smaller species. Olivia, do you want to just talk about the relative risk and how farmers, what I don't want is that farmers might say, just spend ungodly amount of time trying to control a small species that doesn't pose a lot of food safety risk.
Yeah, my guess is that they're probably either house sparrows, song sparrows, or house finches, just based on what I've seen use high tunnels in Michigan. And the one that I would be the most concerned about would be the house sparrows. They can carry foodborne pathogens a little bit more, but I think based on the data that we have, the songbird poops don't seem to be very conducive to bacterial survival. So it's probably not surviving for too long, but like Annalisa was talking about earlier, I wouldn't pick it if you find poop on it, but it's probably not particularly likely to be carrying a viable pathogen by the time you eat it.
The damage is another thing, of course. I mean, if it's damaged, it's damaged. It doesn't really matter. Um, the species that damaged it, you can't sell that. If this is for home consumption, it doesn't matter. But sometimes I get questions on could I can them? And it's like it just no, you need to start with whole, good quality, not disease, not damaged product if you're doing further processing as well. So that becomes can make yourself some spaghetti sauce tonight. Because you can take that risk on for yourself. But for other people, we don't know their immune status. We don't know the impact that it could have on them. We don't know how they're going to cook it. So it becomes farmer food.
Joanne has a comment. Well, it's important to not let birds build nests in packing sheds. It's fine to allow nests in barns where packing materials are stored. Is it fine?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Packing materials are something that I think often gets overlooked, and it's almost always mice, but yeah, it could be birds too in the area where they're being stored. So I would definitely store your packing materials in an area away from mice and birds because they will most definitely do damage, and those packing materials are not cheap, right? So covering them, keeping them in a as much as possible a sealed environment, maybe not your, not the machine shed where you just kind of got a bunch of junk in an area where you would keep your food and your food preparation materials is what I would suggest. Covering them with plastic can really help as well.
Yeah. Bird nests should be supported when they're not a risk. That's definitely true, for sure. If there's
Yes.
any other questions, we can throw those in the chat. Otherwise, I just wanted to say thank you to Olivia and Lisa for sharing your knowledge. Thanks for everyone for attending. The role of Birds on the Midwest Farms webinar series is part of a professional development grant from North Central Region of SARE. So thank you, Sarah, for making this possible. We'd love your feedback. If you need CE credits, we need your license number. Those of you who fill out the evaluation, we also will enter you in a drawing to win a hat, a super cool Wow Farm Alliance hat. And there are additional resources and research papers related to this webinar on the website on our resource page for this webinar, where we will also be posting the recording. And we hope to see you at our next webinar on February 3rd. Thank you both so much.